on a day, he spoke of rebellion against Russia's Ministry of Defense, whose leaders had spurned Prigozhin and his Wagner group for what Prigozhin had deemed to be the last time. In the following hours, Prigozhin's forces would take over a strategic Russian city, then storm their way northward, crashing through roadblocks and shooting down helicopters on their way to the Russian capital of Moscow. It was an incredibly bold feat, one that put Prigozhin in the crosshairs of Russian autocrat Vladimir Putin himself. And though both Putin and Prigozhin would survive that day, the entire affair brought up a critical question. How had Prigozhin escaped Putin's vengeful wrath, if indeed he had escaped at all? Now, exactly 2 months to the day after Prigozhin led the Wagner Group's attempted coup, we have our answer. On August 23rd, 2023, Yevgeny Prigozhin, 6 of his associates, and 3 flight crew members plummeted to their deaths near the Russian village of Kuzhenkino, in the heart of Russia, roughly halfway between Moscow and St. Petersburg. The death of Yevgeny Prigozhin and the circumstances behind the airplane crash that ended his life are murky at best, and more information will certainly be released in the coming weeks on what will happen to Prigozhin's feared Wagner Group. But today, in this special and rather rushed episode of Orographics, we're going to be digging into the death of Prigozhin himself, how it happens, what it means, and what comes next. Before we even begin to discuss an analysis of Prigozhin's demise, we first got to nail down precisely what happens, at least to the extent that it's possible to do so when trying to peer through the veil into Vladimir Putin's Russia. And we've got to include a disclaimer here that for now, like everybody else in the world, we can only report news based on the information coming out of Russia itself, a place where we hope it's no surprise to you, state media is carefully and constantly tailored to present a version of events that is agreeable to Putin's regime. Naturally, we don't know what we don't know, and it's entirely likely that many of the big questions about this incident will actually just remain unanswered forever. What we do know is that on August the 23rd, 2023, at roughly 6:15 p.m. local time, an Embraer Legacy 600 aircraft fell out of the sky in Tver Oblast, the region of Russia located immediately to the northwest of Moscow. The twin-engine business jet produced by Brazilian aerospace corporation Embraer, the Legacy 600 is a reliable jet with a nigh-on impeachable service record and zero history of the sort of incidents that would lead to this sort of crash. But this particular Legacy 600 was already well known before the crash. Identified by the call sign Romeo Alpha 02795, the jet is known to be Yevgeny Prigozhin's personal transport. So when news broke via Russia's state media that an Embraer aircraft had crashed, the most important question immediately became whether Prigozhin had been on board. Prior to the crash, the plane had been observed on global flight tracking websites as having left Moscow about half an hour earlier before climbing to a height of about 8,500 meters or 28,000 feet. But once the plane reached altitude, its data transmission suddenly ceased, possibly because its transponder had been disabled or possibly because the plane no longer existed. Critically, the transponder had sent no data to indicate that the plane had begun losing altitude, a fact that put the next piece of information into stark contrast. As depicted in a video posted by Echo FM to the social media app formerly known as Twitter, a plane believed to be Prigozhin's Embraer was spotted falling from the sky in what's called a flat spin, where the plane's fuselage basically stays level with the horizon, but the plane spins uncontrollably in a pattern that is exceptionally difficult to recover from. After the plane is seen falling out of the air nearby to an oddly shaped cloud that may signify an explosion, it disappears behind a greenhouse. A few moments later, the same video depicts a plume of black smoke rising from the ground in what is almost certainly the spot where Yevgeny Prigozhin met his end. Before long, Russian state media began to confirm that there had been bodies discovered at the crash site, then that there had been 10 people on the flight, and then, after that Yevgeny Prigozhin himself had been listed on the passenger manifest. Then, the Wagner Group's Telegram channels began to claim that Prigozhin had been confirmed dead. Then, on-the-ground images and video began to circulate of the site where the plane crashed, including ones that depicted a wide patch of ground engulfed in flames. More news about the plane's condition emerged, including that its vertical stabilizer, its tail fin, seemed to be missing as it plummeted to Earth. Finally, the Russian Federal Air Transport Agency confirmed the news that the entire world had known was coming. Yevgeny Prigozhin had been on board that flight and was confirmed dead. As we mentioned in the intro, Yevgeny Prigozhin has been widely understood to be a target for assassination for the past 2 months in the aftermath of his Wagner Group's failed coup attempt against Moscow. Now, here at Orographics, we actually did a similar special episode covering Wagner's march on the Russian capital when it happened, so do check that out if you'd like a deep dive on it. But here, we're just going to quickly recap the basics. Prior to June of 2023, Prigozhin and his Wagner Group had been longtime supporters of Vladimir Putin's regime, a private mercenary company made up mostly of volunteers. At least prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Wagner Group got their start helping Russia annex Crimea and then waging a low-grade insurgency in Ukraine's Donbass region from the mid-2010s all the way up until Russia's full-scale invasion. They also played a major role in Russia's intervention in Syria during the civil war there. Other Wagner units are dispatched around the world, particularly in Asia, Africa, and the South American country of Venezuela, where their job is to protect Russian interests from gold and diamond mines to allied military training programs to Russia-backed heads of state. Basically, the Wagner Group are the guys you want to send to do your dirty work. They're disciplined, they're regimented, they're well-trained, but they aren't technically Russian troops, meaning that it's difficult for world governments to hold Russia directly responsible for their actions. They're also willing to cross a lot of lines in order to execute their mission, from crimes against humanity in several nations to butchery of civilians to the killing of journalists. So, to put it simply, the Wagner Group have never not been the bad guys. Seriously, we're talking cartoon TV villain levels of nefariousness from these people constantly, with real pain and suffering being brought to everybody in their path. But they've also been bad guys on Vladimir Putin's payroll, something that only became more clear with their involvement in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Wagner forces have achieved somewhat limited battlefield success, but they are constantly involved on the bloodiest fronts of the Ukraine war, often using waves of poorly trained, poorly armed fighters recruited straight out of Russia's prisons. They've proven to be excellent at forcing grinding wars of attrition, the sort of battles where they might lose 1 or 5 or 10 of their prisoner conscripts for every Ukrainian defender who's killed, but in reality, they'll sacrifice 10 troops they see as expendable in order to claim the life of one experienced, battle-hardened warrior on the Ukrainian side. But over the past year or so, the Wagner Group, and particularly Yevgeny Prigozhin, have been at odds with Russia's Ministry of Defense over a wide range of issues du jour. Some days, Prigozhin and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, plus his right-hand stooge, General Valery Gerasimov, would go to war over battle tactics. Other days, it would be over incidents where Wagner or Russian forces ended up shelling each other's positions by mistake, and other days, it would be about ammunition or troop shortages in critical areas. Generally, this sort of disagreement isn't really a problem for Vladimir Putin himself. A shrewd manipulator and a veteran of the Soviet KGB spy agency, Putin has a long habit of maintaining control over his underlings by pitting them against each other and allowing them to fight among themselves rather than build strength to oppose him. But after months of mutual escalation between the Wagner Group and the Russian Ministry of Defense, or MOD, things came to a head when Defense Minister Shoigu was able to convince Putin to endorse a plan to integrate the Wagner Group into the Russian military directly. Far from an honor for Prigozhin, this would have placed the warlord and his mercenary army as direct subordinates to Shoigu and Putin's willingness to endorse this plan appears to have signaled to Prigozhin that Shoigu had essentially won their rivalry. It's around this time that Prigozhin is believed to have started laying the groundwork for what came 2 weeks later, a bold play to force Shoigu out of his position beside Putin. On the 23rd of June, 2023, Prigozhin released a video rejecting Vladimir Putin's rationale for invading Ukraine and exposing the true nature of Russia's destructive, unjustified war of expansion in direct contradiction to the propaganda Russian state media had forced down their citizens' throats for over a year. In subsequent audio recordings, Prigozhin declared a march for justice against the Russian MOD, and within a few hours, a column of Wagner fighters had captured the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. Far from just being any old Russian city, Rostov-on-Don was essentially a forward operating base for Russia's entire invasion of Ukraine, and just as important to Prigozhin, it was where Defense Minister Shoigu was believed to be located. In what appears to have been a failed attempt to capture Shoigu, Wagner took the city, and in a striking show of apathy towards Vladimir Putin, neither the military forces within the city nor a separate nearby column of Chechen fighters loyal to Putin chose to engage Wagner forces. Once it became clear that senior MOD officials had escaped their grasp, a column of some 5,000 to 8,000 mercenaries began an advance northward toward Moscow. On their way, the convoy established a presence in towns along their route, smashed through roadblocks, and brought down multiple attack helicopters and a command and control plane, even launching missiles into the town of Voronezh. Moscow was forced to barricade itself, and Vladimir Putin, no longer sure that he wasn't Prigozhin's target, is believed to have fled the city, according to flight tracking data. Although Prigozhin was eventually convinced to back off from Moscow, his troops are believed to have come as close as 95 kilometers from the city, very narrowly averting what many said could have been the start of a civil war. We're going through all of this history today to illustrate the depth and magnitude at which Yevgeny Prigozhin royally f***ed up. To put it simply, a person does not do that to Vladimir Putin's Russia and expect to walk away, no matter their justification and no matter what power they think that they have. In Prigozhin's case, Western intelligence believes that his family may have been taken as leverage to coerce him to halt his advance, and while the Wagner column faced only limited resistance on their way to Moscow, it appears that Russian forces did indeed dig in around the city in order to defend it. But in the immediate aftermath of the coup, Prigozhin appeared to, well, not pay the price for his transgressions, and in fact, not pay it in the slightest. Although his allies in the Russian MOD, most prominently the General Sergei Surovikin, appeared to be punished for their ties to him, Prigozhin escaped serious reprisal, quite possibly having face-to-face meetings with Putin himself in the days following his failed coup attempt. He and his Wagner Group fighters were sent to Belarus or given the choice to integrate into the Russian military, but not punished outright. And even despite his supposed exile, Prigozhin's movements have been tracked around Moscow and St. Petersburg in the intervening months with the kind of obvious regularity that suggests that the Russian government couldn't have possibly missed him. The coup attempt prompted no outpouring of support for Putin, no condemnation of the Wagner Group, and more questions than answers in regard to the readiness of the Russian military proper. But ever since the coup took place, the majority of international onlookers have assumed that Prigozhin's time would come, even if Putin and the MOD had to suffer something of a loss of face in the interim. So when news broke that Prigozhin's personal plane had crashed, it was much less, oh, what? And more of, well, what took so long? Although we cannot assign responsibility for the destruction of his plane at this stage, don't worry, we'll be digging into that thorny issue in just a moment, it's certainly not out of the ordinary for Putin's opponents to experience somewhat sketchy ends to their lives. Oligarch Pavel Antov found himself on the wrong side of a hotel window in India in December of 2022, shortly after it published and then deleted criticism of Putin's war in Ukraine. Another oligarch and war critic, Revil Maganov, also found himself on the wrong side of a window, although in his case, that window was attached to a hospital in Moscow. Press Minister Mikhail Lesin ended up dead in Washington, D.C. in a hotel room in 2015, while Boris Nemtsov was shot in the back 4 times outside the Kremlin itself. Alexander Litvinenko, a former KGB agent, died of radiation poisoning 3 weeks after he drank a cup of tea laced with polonium-210. And these are just a few in a long list of individuals who've met similar fates for far lesser transgressions than those of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Also on Prigozhin's doomed flight was a man named Dmitry Utkin, a figure long known to be the Wagner Group's battlefield commander, boasting a body adorned with Nazi tattoos and a reputation for butchery in combat and a willingness to commit any number of war crimes in service to the Wagner Group. It's Utkin who is often regarded as Wagner's true leader. His call sign, Wagner, is how the mercenary organization got its name, a tribute to one of Adolf Hitler's favorite classical composers. Following on with his status as Wagner's top man on the grounds, it may well have been Utkin who personally led the Wagner Group's advance on Moscow. Even if he didn't, it's exceptionally unlikely that an operation on the scale of Wagner's coup attempts would have gone down without his explicit approval, making him just as much of a target as Prigozhin was. Add to that the fact that Utkin had the technical and warfighting knowledge to do real damage to Russian and Ukrainian forces alike, and it's hardly a surprise that an assassination attempt against Prigozhin would have been time to take out Utkin too. The other people on the plane, including 2 Wagner officers, the head of Wagner security and foreign logistics, and 2 of Prigozhin's personal bodyguards, would have been similarly unobjectionable targets for a Putin regime bent on revenge. Now, obviously, we don't want to be victim blaming here, but we would sincerely hope that it was neither a surprise to Prigozhin nor to Utkin that they might have ended up on a certain dictator's hit list. Although Utkin might have been allowed to travel to Belarus, although Prigozhin may have been allowed to visit St. Petersburg and release public statements, it's not really been a question of whether either man would have a bit of pain and even an untimely demise in his future. The only question is how long that might have taken to go down. Before you go on, we've got to acknowledge that there is a non-zero chance, however small, that the crash of Prigozhin's plane was accidental. Plane crashes happen, however infrequently, and although we here at Warographics find it extremely unlikely that this was a simple coincidence, neither we nor anybody else can rule it out completely. We've also got to point out that even if the crash was accidental, well, it doesn't really matter. To put it simply, this is geopolitics, and the truth in geopolitics is very rarely the most important factor at play. What matters is what the world believes that the truth is, and what the world does in response to what it presumes to be true. And in a world where a Russian warlord who led a march on Moscow against a murderous dictator with a long history of organizing the deaths of his rivals plummets out of the sky into a fiery plane crash, well, it's as good as guaranteed that this incident will be treated as a brazen act of revenge by the Putin regime. Assuming that the crash was an assassination, the next question is, how did it happen? On the social media app Telegram, users of a Wagner-associated channel called Grey Zone claimed that the plane had been shot down by Russian air defenses, as evidenced by the testimony of nearby residents who claimed that there were 2 explosions prior to the crash and witnessed 2 vapor trails. Conspicuously, the video we mentioned earlier depicting the falling plane showed nothing in the way of vapor trails that would have come from a missile. As with everything about this incident, that doesn't mean that we can be completely sure that Russian surface-to-air missiles weren't used, but it certainly doesn't seem likely given the available evidence. That being said, it seems safe to say that something happened in the air before the crew lost control of their plane. According to flight tracking site FlightRadar24, new data analyzed hours after the crash showed that the plane had stopped transmitting its positional time at 6:11 p.m. local time, but continued to transmit other data, including altitude, until 6:20 p.m. In the plane's last minute of flight, it climbed and dove several times, peaking at an altitude of 30,000 feet before pitching forward into a dive of 8,000 feet per minute. Then the plane's transponder went quiet for good. With those clues, we can at least glean some insight into what Prigozhin's final moments may have looked like and what his assassins might have done in order to kill him. According to CNN, aerospace analyst Miles O'Brien, interviewed after Prigozhin had been confirmed dead, multiple factors suggest that some sort of explosion was to blame. The missing vertical stabilizer, the spinning and trailed smoke as the plane fell to the ground, and the plane appearing to be on fire even before it impacted the ground. Whether that hit came from a bomb inside the aircraft or a missile is unclear, but the plane's climbs and dives prior to the explosion wouldn't make sense if the passengers had discovered a bomb on board. Taking into account the lack of trails that would indicate a surface-to-air missile, the next open question is whether Russian military planes, perhaps with their own transponders off, may have been in the area. After all, fighter jets could easily have been long gone by the time the falling plane was captured on video. But the final factor, the fact that the plane's transponder became partially blocked from transmitting data a full 9 minutes before the crash, would suggest that the plane entered an area where its communications were actively jammed. Put simply, it appears that Prigozhin and his plane flew into a trap. But whose trap was it? Now, the obvious choice, of course, is Vladimir Putin. By this point, it should be more than apparent that Putin's got a track record for this sort of thing, and it's important to note that such a public demise for his greatest rival inside Russia is exactly the sort of deterrent that Putin seems to think will cow the rest of his associates into submission. At the time of the crash, Putin was at a public event and was noted as appearing somewhat pleased with, we assume, the general way that his day was going, although we do need to qualify that this is pleased on the Putin scale, the man with about the same range of facial expressions as a Russian nesting doll. And in a potentially related piece of news, Russia had announced earlier the same day that a Prigozhin ally within the Russian MOD, General Sergei Surovikin, had been relieved of his duties as a military commander. Surovikin is believed to be under house arrest, but has not been seen in public or even confirmed alive since the day of Wagner's march on Moscow, an act that apparently Surovikin was given advance notice about. When adding Surovikin, or at least his job title, to the August 23rd body count, today's events look eerily like a purge of the Russian military world. Of course, there's also the possibility that Ukraine might have been behind the assassination. The nation was due to mark its Independence Day one day after Prigozhin's plane was brought down, and between Ukraine's clearly demonstrated capacity for sabotage and its ability to sneak aerial drones into the nearby Russian capital city of Moscow, it's not inconceivable that Ukraine might have had the reach to take out Prigozhin themselves. Decapitating the Wagner group will never not be a good thing for Ukraine, especially after the countless war crimes Wagner has committed on Ukrainian soil. Now, we do have to stress here that Ukraine is far less able to exert this sort of lethal influence inside Russia than, well, Russia, but it's far from an impossibility. And thirdly, there's the possibility that whatever assassination did take place was carried out by the Russian MOD directly, either with Putin's tacit approval but minimal involvement, or of the MOD's own volition. Defense Minister Shoigu and General Valery Gerasimov have both demonstrated that they would be more than happy to see Prigozhin meet an unfortunate end, and now, with Prigozhin out of play as a military actor, Putin needs his MOD leaders as much as they need him. It's not out of the question that that level of influence might have given the Russian MOD the expendable political capital they would need to carry out that sort of operation and get away with it, especially considering that even if Putin were to be ideologically opposed for some reason, a dead Yevgeny Prigozhin does still serve his interests nonetheless. Around the world, the news has been met largely with nonchalant acceptance, seen as much more an internal Russian matter than anything world leaders would really have to weigh in on. American President Joe Biden said of Prigozhin's death, "I don't know for a fact what happens, but I'm not surprised. There's not much that happens in Russia that Putin's not behind." Said Ukrainian presidential aide Mikhailo Podolyak, "Putin was waiting for the moment. It is also obvious that Prigozhin signed a special death warrant for himself the moment he believed in Lukashenko's bizarre guarantees and Putin's equally absurd word of honor." Or take the words of Polish Foreign Minister Zbigniew Rau, quote, "It so happens that political opponents whom Vladimir Putin considers a threat to his power do not die naturally." What can we say? Right on. Well, the end of Yevgeny Prigozhin and Dmitry Yukin might be the end of the Wagner Group itself, at least in the long arc of history. But it'll take some time to get to that long arc, and in the intervening weeks and months, Wagner is an issue that Russia will have to deal with sooner rather than later. At present, most remaining Wagner fighters are stationed in Russia's neighboring country of Belarus, while handfuls are dispatched around the world in small or mid-sized units, all sorts of work we mentioned earlier on, protecting diamond mines, bodyguarding foreign leaders, committing the wholesale slaughter of civilians, that sort of thing. According to former CIA director Leon Panetta, the Russian MOD may attempt to take over the Wagner Group, directly incorporating its fighters into the proper Russian military rather than let the group keep operating with a level of autonomy. What that means for the interests Wagner protects around the world is unclear. After all, a big part of the reason the Wagner Group protects them is because the Russian government would rather not take responsibility for what is generally seen as nefarious and subversive acts. But there's also no indicator and certainly no reason to believe that the Wagner Group will take this lying down. Although Utkin and Prigozhin were both spiritual leaders to the mercenary group, and Utkin was also a very real tactical and strategic leader, they're nowhere near the only people involved in the Wagner Group who are capable of calling the shots. Immediately after Prigozhin was confirmed dead, sources in Belarus indicated that Wagner convoys were headed en masse to the Russian border, despite the work of Belarusian special operators attempting to get in their way. What that means What they might want, and whether they're even planning to remain a part of a separate entity known as Wagner, is yet unknown. But what seems fairly clear is that the Wagner Group is unlikely to resist the tides of the Russian MOD for much longer. It's not totally inconceivable that Putin pulls some sort of bait and switch, relieving Sergei Surovikin of his military duties only to install him as the Wagner Group's next leader. But to call such an outcome unlikely would be an understatement. Unfortunately for the people of Ukraine, it's unlikely that Prigozhin's death will have any meaningful impact on Russia's war effort as a whole. Although the Wagner Group has been an instrumental part of battles like the one that took place in and around the town of Bakhmut, they've already been pushed out of Ukraine following Prigozhin's attempt on Moscow, meaning that the Russian war effort as it exists right now is not reliant on Wagner fighters. If anything, Prigozhin's and Ukin's deaths may disabuse some Wagner fighters from their faith in their mercenary organization and incentivize them to join the fold alongside Russia's soldiers. As many Ukrainians see it, according to the BBC, the best case scenario from Prigozhin's death would be a degradation of Russia's own internal stability, perhaps even to the point that the country might be on track to an implosion as Putin is forced to take more and more drastic measures to cling to power. And lastly, there's the question of what all this means for Vladimir Putin, who still sits as the grand puppet master behind all things in Russia. In the short term, this play appears to strengthen Putin's position. It is a bold, unmistakable statement that he holds absolute power in Russia and that his authority is not to be f***ed with by any person under any circumstance. It's easy to underestimate the importance of a basic scare tactic in world politics, but sometimes there's simply nothing like it. And now Putin can face his elites with a simple reality. It will cost them far less and be far less dangerous to them personally to simply go along with the expectations and confines that Putin sets out. But at the same time, there's the opposite reality, that such brazen acts of violence by Putin, if indeed he is responsible for the death of Prigozhin, are the acts of a desperate man who's running out of options. As political scientist Brian Klaas put it in a piece for The Atlantic, this tends to create two sorts of problems for a dictator in Putin's position. With his trusted elites realizing that they must not be so trusted and might not be so immune from their dictator's whims, it's likely that a culture of mistrust and paranoia will begin to take off. And in Russia's case, that sort of culture wasn't unheard of anyway. In that sort of environment, more and more of those elites will begin to do the maths on whether it's worth continuing to back Putin or whether they've entered into a situation where either the dictator or they will survive to see the following year. Add to that the high likelihood that Russian officials will want to avoid Prigozhin's mistakes, most prominently being open and honest about the truth of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. Lose that honesty, and Putin becomes far more prone to unforced errors, which for a guy who thought he'd take over Ukraine in a span of a few days, really isn't a thing that you'd want to happen more frequently than it already does. Every political action has a cost, and for Vladimir Putin, it may well be that the cost of assassinating Prigozhin is worth bearing. But it goes to show the rate at which once trusted allies of the Russian president are now turning into enemies, cannon fodder, exiles, dissidents, and in the case of Prigozhin and Utkin, corpses. Suffer those sorts of costs for long, and Putin's war in Ukraine will become, well and truly unwinnable. Suffer the costs for long enough, and Putin will one day find himself without allies to call upon the next time somebody decides to attempt a coup. In the aftermath of Prigozhin's death, that count of allies hasn't just dropped by a few, it's dropped by thousands upon thousands of members of the Wagner Group. How long the Russian war effort can survive without them remains to be seen. But as the ghost of Yevgeny Prigozhin now glares over Putin's shoulder at the battlefields of Ukraine, it becomes abundantly clear that if this war effort runs in a way where even Putin's closest associates are targets on their back, then the same war effort simply cannot last forever.
How was it possible that the whole of the German musical profession and establishment turned overnight into Nazi collaborators?
Furtwängler gave us first-class performances that are still admired today.
Wir sind das auserkorene Musikvolk der Welt.
Propaganda.
In Auschwitz I, they had half the Vienna Philharmonic sitting there. It's part of the German culture.
Jewish prisoners performing Mozart and Schumann and Beethoven for their German gods.
The Nazis
succeeded in destroying many things, but music? You can't destroy that. You can try, but it's impossible.
Hier spricht Anita Lasker, eine deutsche Jüdin aus Breslau. Ich spreche aus dem Konzentrationslager Bergen-Belsen und komme aus Auschwitz.
Ja, wir haben da plötzlich...
We suddenly heard an announcement in English.
Auf Englisch. Ich kann mich nicht genau
I can't remember exactly how it went, but it said we were supposed to stay where we were. When the British came, they had no idea what they would find. They thought they were liberating a prison camp. But this wasn't a prison camp. It was a pit of corpses.
Eine Leichengrube.
Noch können wir es nicht begreifen, noch glauben wir zu träumen. Wir sehen die Engländer durch das Lager fahren, Menschen, die uns nichts Böses wollen, Menschen, die uns helfen wollen. Wir können es nicht begreifen. Man hat Wasser gebracht, Wasser. 3 Wochen waren wir ohne Wasser. Die Menschen sind verdurstet. Heute früh ist noch eine Kameradin von mir gestorben.
Leb,
Live, you're free.
Aber manchmal zu spät.
But for some, it was too late. That's how it was. It was indescribable. Suddenly, we're alive.
Ja. Aber Sie haben wahrscheinlich
But you've probably heard Dimbleby's description of Belsen.
Beschreibung von Belsen. Ja.
Belsen was unimaginable.
Unwahrscheinlich.
Here, over an acre of ground, lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which, except perhaps by a convulsive movement or the last quiver of a sigh from a living skeleton too weak to move. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life.
Bergen-Belsen gibt es keinen Kamin. Das heißt, das Elend wird nicht verbrannt, so wie es in Auschwitz war. Hier haben die Leute gehungert. Hier war Typhus, hier war Schmutz, Läuse, keine Hygiene, keine Ambulanz, keine Medikamente.
Und da gibt es also ein Bild von meiner Schwester.
There's a video of my sister talking to a British soldier. And there's another of 3 girls walking back to the
Die
camp.
das Lager zurücklaufen und ich bin es.
That's me.
Ich befinde mich mit meiner Schwester seit 3 Jahren in Haft. Ich bin politischer Häftling. Ich habe französischen Kriegsgefangenen über die Grenze verholfen.
Ich weiß, ich habe da irgendwo gesessen und hat mir
I
gesagt,
remember I was sitting somewhere and someone told me there was a jeep or something from the BBC. They wanted to interview people and that I should go over.
da mal hin. So kam
That
ich
was my
erst
first encounter with a microphone.
mit einem Mikrofon damals.
Ich möchte zuerst ein paar Worte über Auschwitz sagen. Die Auschwitzer Häftlinge, die wenigen, die geblieben sind, fürchten alle, dass die Welt nicht glauben wird, was dort geschehen ist. Dort hat man lebendige, gesunde Menschen lebend ins Feuer geworfen. Die Schreie hörten wir bis in unsere Baracke. Dazu wurde immer Musik gemacht. Ich selbst befand mich in der Musikkapelle. Für den furchtbarsten Dingen wurde Musik gemacht.
I always somehow knew that, in my mind, the cello saved my grandmother's life. So that was always somehow in the atmosphere of the family story.
Die Zerstörung des deutschen Musiklebens spricht sich vor allem auch darin aus, dass die Zentren, wo es sich abgespielt hat, wo es kulminiert hat, rein materiell gesprochen zerstört sind. Das sind die Säle.
After the Second World War, German conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler's career was also on the brink of ruin. The victorious power saw him as Hitler's pet maestro. He was banned from performing and in 1946 was brought before a denazification tribunal. Furtwängler faced uncomfortable questions. Was he a Nazi? Did he bear any guilt? Why hadn't he left Germany? In 1947, the tribunal classified Furtwängler as a follower, a category that carried no penalty. He soon began performing again with the Berlin Philharmonic, and his return to the stage was a great success. Wilhelm Furtwängler was born in Berlin in 1886. His musical career took off at an early age. At 20, he was already conducting symphony orchestras.
Es ist so überzeugend, dass it's so powerful. And I say this as someone in the same profession. My God, it doesn't get better than that. Sometimes I think, if someone can conduct like that, then maybe I should just pack up and quit. That's not really a nice feeling. Listening to Furtwängler elicits everything from profound exhilaration to the sense of being completely insignificant and powerless. Ganz klein und machtlos fühlt.